Hi everyone. I just finished reading chapter 4 in the book My System by Nimzowitsch, and the title of the chapter is Passed Pawns. So let's take a look at this position. So here white has a 3-2 pawn majority on the king side. So Nimzowitsch tells us when you have a healthy pawn majority like this, you should be able to push it and create a passed pawn. Now the point of this position is to identify which of these three pawns is called the candidate. The candidate is the pawn that's going to become the passed pawn. And Nimzowitsch tells us the candidate is the one that's unopposed, which is the F pawn. He says he sees a lot of beginners make the mistake of pushing the wrong pawn first. The candidate is the one that should be pushed first in order to create the passed pawn. For example, if you push the G pawn first, then black can just paralyze your whole majority with a single thrust, G5. So to create the passed pawn, you push your candidate pawn first, the one that's unopposed. And this isn't a serious position here for study because white's clearly winning. There could be more pieces on the board than what we're seeing. And the point of this is just to see how the passed pawn is created. So we're just going to watch the black king move back and forth while white creates the passed pawn. And the way it happens is like that. So eventually this G pawn needs to support the F pawn coming to F6. And now white will get a passed pawn either by pushing the F pawn or black may exchange and he'll have an F pawn in return. Okay, so that's the method. So let's take a look at another position that's slightly changed and talk about how white's going to use this healthy majority to create the passed pawn. Again, he should start by pushing the candidate pawn, which is the F pawn. And let's just watch black measure time with his king. And now it's important to play G3. For example, if you play H3, then black can just paralyze that majority and white can make no more progress. So you play G3 first, and then H3, and then G4, and then F5. So all of those pawns were necessary to get that F pawn passed now. So black can exchange it, but white will get a passed F pawn. All right, let's take a look at this position. So here, black already has a passed pawn. He's clearly winning the position, but we just want to make a quick point. Nimzowitsch takes a lot of pages and a lot of effort to explain the necessity of blockading passed pawns, and sometimes even pawns that aren't passed. He talks about blockading a lot. And he says there are many reasons to blockade a passed pawn. For example, white can move one of his minor pieces in front of that passed pawn. And he says one reason is to stifle black's development, to keep his other pieces from getting into the game. So notice how that passed pawn is blocking the path of that bishop, and it's blocking one of the movements of the knight, and it's blocking the rook's movement as well. So that's one reason to blockade a passed pawn. And he says the sooner you do it, the better off you are. Okay, let's look at an example from a game. So here, black has a majority here on the king side, these three versus these two. And he's going to start by pushing his candidate pawn F4. So one of the reasons for pushing that pawn is not necessarily to gain a passed pawn and then queen it. You know, there's a lot of pieces in the way here. But one reason to push that pawn is because it leaves this empty square behind. And one of black's knights can occupy that square. So white takes, and now black pushes his G pawn past the F pawn in order to drive the bishop back to an awkward square. And so black is going to continue to attack on the king side with this 2-to-1 majority now. and that square has been vacated, so he can put his H knight on that square. And that knight's threatening to come to e3, so white decided to protect that third rank with the queen. Black exchanged pawns, and white calls check. Black moves his king, and then white brings the queen back to the third rank for defensive purposes. So with that exchange of pawns, black opened another square for a possible piece to come to. Now, white does have some passed pawns here, but black is the one with the initiative and black is the one on the attack. He pushes h5, rook ad1, h4, rook d3, lending some more defense to the third rank. Black brings his other knight into the game onto that nice vacated square. Queen to d2 to save the queen. Rook g8, so black is supporting his kingside majority, and he plans on pushing it. White exchanges off a pair of minor pieces, and then gets his king out of the way, and black pushes to g3. And this is where the example in the book ends, and Nimzowitsch just mentions that black has a strong attack. So when I put this into the engine says, yeah, it's about negative 0.5 or so. So it's nothing decisive, but it's the plan that Nimzowitsch wanted to present to us, not necessarily a line of best play. So he wanted to show how pushing these pawns forward, especially this candidate pawn, can leave these squares behind that can be occupied. Okay, let's have a look at another position that occurred in a game. I remember in this position, the world champion Alekhine had the white pieces. And he played e4. Okay, he wants to dislodge this blockader. This knight is blockading his d-pawn. He'd like to push his d-pawn forward. He dislodges the blockader. Now black counterattacks with f6. Okay, white takes the knight. Black takes the knight. And now a strong pawn push to d6, which opens the line for the light squared bishop. Now black took the pawn right away with his rook here in the actual game, but Nimzowitsch tells us the line of best play that black should have followed was to move e4, so that after taking, then you can take with the rook. Otherwise, if you take with the rook right away, then white has this move and gains that pawn and drives the rook back, and then he'll win that pawn as well. Okay, so he says e4 is best, king takes e4, then the rook can take the pawn, and then he gives this move king to e5 a double exclam, and rook cd8 follows, and then bishop takes e6. And Nimzowitsch ends the line here and praises white for his play, especially the pawn sacrifice, pushing the pawn to d6 like that. Unfortunately, Nimzowitsch was mistaken. There are some errors in this book. I've noticed several in this chapter, and some of them are actually major errors. But we can't fault Nimzowitsch for writing this book in 1930 when we can look at it now with engines. So we'll forgive him his errors, especially since he's just trying to convey some ideas here. It doesn't really matter if the actual moves shown are that precise or not. We can still absorb his positional ideas. So here's why this is a mistake. It's because the engine tells me black actually has a mate in 4. Okay, and I think maybe if Nimzowitsch had analyzed further, he would have found the mate in 4. You have to question white's strategy here of bringing his king so far up the board. Black begins by taking the bishop with check, forcing the white king even further up the board. And now a really great move, rook to d5, cutting the king off so the king cannot retreat. And now it's a mate and 2 moves from here. It doesn't matter what white does. For example, a3, there's a check, and then a mate. Okay. All right, next position. So this is the same position we just looked at, but I wanted to take a look at the way the actual game progressed. So e4 attacking the knight, f6 counterattacking. The knights got traded, and now d6, the key move we were looking at. In the game, Black didn't play Nimzowicz's move of e4. He just took the pawn, and maybe it was because he was afraid of the line of play we just saw that Nimzowitsch praised. Well, that allowed f takes e5, and Black just could not retreat his rook and lose the e6 pawn, so he decided to give up the exchange. And it was a pretty standard, uneventful win for white, for Alekhine. And we won't go through the whole game. Okay, let's have a look at this position. So another concept Nimzowitsch tries to teach us is the quality of a blockader, how stable it is. And in this case, the black rook is blockading the white pawn. And sometimes a blockader is only as stable as the rest of his army makes him. He needs defenders. And that bishop is defending that rook right now, but that bishop can be chased around. It's black to move, and perhaps black may move the bishop to g6 where it's protected by his rook. He doesn't want to leave it somewhere where he's going to eventually get it forked with the king and the bishop. But then white can bring the king up, and maybe black now supports the rook from a different angle. Unfortunately, that doesn't work because of the nice tactic. Check, forking the king and the bishop. King protects the bishop. Queen takes it anyway, drawing off the defender of the rook. And then that's an easily won king and pawn endgame for white. So the point of that position is just to show you that that rook as a blockader was unstable. But then Nimzowitsch compares it to this position, which is the same position, but there's a pair of pawns here. And actually, he starts the position here, and there's a pair of pawns. So he says this time that rook is a really good blockader because black would save his bishop with bishop to f3, and the bishop is very stable, stabilized by the pawn. So that bishop will remain a permanent defender of that blockading piece. And Nimzowitsch says because of that, black has excellent drawing chances in this position. And to my eye, it just looks plainly drawn. I can't see a plan for white to make progress, but maybe you can. Okay, let's take a look at this position. So here the black bishop is blockading the white A pawn. Now, the lesson we're going to learn here is that sometimes you may want to force your opponent to switch blockaders. That bishop is an excellent blockader here because it's stopping the white king from approaching and helping the pawn promote. It has control of that square. Well, watch the maneuver white enacts. Calls check, threatening the bishop, forcing the rook to block to protect the bishop. And now the move rook takes a8 is the correct move here, forcing black into a new blockader, having a new blockader now. And that's the blockader white would rather face because he can now approach it. Okay, and here's what would happen. The rook has to slide out somewhere. White queens, forces the exchange. And this is actually a winning king and pawn endgame. There's a lot of king and pawn endgames in this chapter too. Let's just take a quick look at how this one would play out. So that pawn, white's pawn, is far enough advanced that if white wins the black pawn, regardless of where the black king is, it will be a one ending. So all white has to do is win that pawn, and he's going to approach it from this side. black can't just passively defend it. We've seen in some of my earlier endgame videos, king and pawn endgame videos, that if white can achieve one of these key squares, which he obviously can, then defending the pawn isn't going to work. White will be able to outflank him and push him away. So black's only hope here is to run for the white pawn and try to win it before white wins the black pawn. Let's see what happens. King g7, king b7, king g6, king c6, and now we're approaching a tactic called a trebuchet. And the point is here, black doesn't want to step on this square because white then steps on this square, and these are corresponding squares, and that forces the black king away somewhere. Okay, it has to move away somewhere, and then white will win the pawn. So maybe black avoids that square and plays king to g5, but then king to d7 attacks the black pawn, and he's either going to lose it or he's now forced to step on that square, and white grabs that corresponding square and wins. Okay, I have a detailed discussion of this kind of an endgame in an earlier video. If you look through my playlist on endgames, you'll find some king and pawn endgames. Okay, let's take a look at this position. Okay, so again, this is a matter, it's like the last example, it's a matter of causing black to exchange blockaders. The bishop is blockading the f-pawn and it's doing a good job at stopping the white king from approaching. So what white wants to do is exchange it, and he does. He takes it and allows the rook to take it because now the white king can approach. Black would have been perfectly safe here, and he would have won the game if his king weren't so far away. But it's far enough away for white to push his pawns to queening. Let's see a sample line. Okay, the rook has to save itself. Pawns start to push. King has to come and help, so he runs to b5. Pawns push. And now I think the only winning move here is king to f5 to keep the black king out. So the black king is now stopped from getting any closer. So maybe king to d7, and then king to g6, king to e6, pushing the pawn, and now black can't stop white from getting a queen. Okay, so interesting exchange of blockaders there. All right, let's have a look at this position. This is a pair of connected passed pawns, and Nimzowitsch says when you have that pair of connected passed pawns, having them on the same rank like this, they're both on the 5th rank, is the healthiest possible position for those pawns. And when you start to move them, what you would like to do is push one of those pawns forward a square and then the other one forward a square so that they're now healthy again right next to each other on the 6th rank. Okay, but you have to be careful and push the correct pawn here. An incorrect pawn push would be b6 check, which Nimzowitsch said happened in a game. This comes from some anonymous game. And the reason that's a bad move is because now black blockades that with his king, and that's a permanent blockade thanks to the light squared bishop controlling a6. So white will never be able to push this pawn to a6 now. This bishop will maintain its presence on this diagonal. Okay. All right, so the correct move is to push the a pawn. And now let's see how the game might play out. If black keeps his bishop on this diagonal, then he may be able to take the a6 pawn if this pawn advances. Okay, so bishop to d4 points the bishop right at the black king, threatens a discovered check. Okay, black is just marking time with his bishop. He can't do anything productive. Now, king to b4 is the discovered check white wants because he wants the king to come to the a5 square to protect his a6 pawn. So king goes back, king to a5, bishop e2, b6. So he successfully pushed his connected passed pawns from the 5th rank to the 6th rank, keeping them in that healthy configuration. and that king is supporting that pawn. So the rest is easy for white to win this, but I'll show you a sample of how he can do it quickly. He can actually arrange a checkmate without having to queen a pawn in a nice, clever way. So he's bringing his king up close, and then he's bringing his bishop back to this diagonal to cover that square. And then he's going to push the pawn with check, forcing the bishop to sacrifice itself, followed by a mate. Okay, let's look at this position. I think this now this is just an instructive position. So here Nimzowitsch wants to teach us how a protected passed pawn is much more powerful than an unprotected passed pawn. So right here, white has this protected passed pawn, protected by that pawn there. And black rather has this majority on the queen side, and he'll be able to create a passed pawn, but not a protected passed pawn. Let's see how white wins this. He starts to attack black's pawns with a4, king to e5. He takes. By the way, a mistake here that white could make is to play c4. That would be an immediate draw because that gives black now a protected passed pawn to counterbalance white's. And that turns out to be a draw. So white takes the pawn, black recaptures, and then white pushes c4. And he's not worried about this outside passer here. He can go collect that up very calmly because white has that protected passed pawn. It's so powerful that white can do whatever he wants. If black ever runs to try to catch that base of the pawn chain, then the forward pawn will queen. So black has to keep an eye on that pawn. So it's very easy. White collects up the pawn and he comes back with his king and helps his f-pawn promote. Okay, now in this position, Nimzowitsch teaches us about the power of the outside passed pawn. So here, each player has a passed pawn, and by definition, the outside passer is the one that's furthest from the center line of the board. So that's the outside passed pawn on h4, and having it is a plus. It makes it easy to win here by using it as a decoy. White pushes it and then abandons it. And while black is collecting it up, white collects up his passed pawn and then runs for the other group of pawns and takes it, and that's an easy win. So that's a simple example of the power of the outside passed pawn. So here's another example that's more complicated of an outside passer and its benefits. So here, each side again has a passed pawn, and Nimzowitsch tells us that white has the outside passer because his c pawn is further from the center line than black's e pawn. And he says it's important for white to use the outside passer as a decoy in the right way at the right time. He points out it would be a mistake to push it here because black would take it and give up his passed pawn, but then black heads for the a file here and by far wins the race. Black just needs to take that pawn, step out of the way, and then queen 4 moves later. That's going to take 6 moves total. White has to take 1, 2, 3 moves to grab that pawn, and then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 total moves to queen his. So black's going to win that race. So what's the correct move then to start? Well, Nimzowitsch says that white should play h4 in order to win. He should start pushing his h-pawn, the one that's going to queen, so that when he does give up this c-pawn as a decoy, this pawn will be closer to queening. Okay, and Nimzowitsch says here that pushing h4 puts black in zugzwang, meaning black is compelled to move when he really doesn't want to. And he says that black has to push the pawn to g6. Okay, and then white uses his c pawn as a decoy, and he's going to win the race, as you'll see. He's going to barely win it by a tempo. White's going to queen first, and the queen is covering the a1 queening square. So white wins this. Maybe black goes to c2 and white can just grab the corner there. Okay, but this is another example where Nimzowitsch makes a mistake. H4 actually doesn't win. This is just a drawn position from the start. There's no way for white to win. The reason H4 doesn't win is because black is not compelled to push the pawn to G6. Black's drawing move here is actually king to C5. Just run for this pair of pawns as quickly as he can, not waiting for white to give it up as a decoy. Now, white has nothing better than to take on E5. Black starts running for these pawns. And now here's the difference. Black will leave that pawn on G7. He should not waste a tempo pushing it. And this time, when white queens, and he will queen first, his king on G7 is blocking him. So his queen is no longer protecting the A1 square, and then black queens mutually, and it's a draw. So just an error in the position. Although that doesn't mean we can't learn anything from it. We still learn the power of the outside passer, how to use it as a decoy, and it makes us cautious to push it at the right time. We may want to improve our position first. You know, if we're going to try something to try to win this, pushing the H-pawn does make sense. Okay, let's look at another position. So here white has this passed C-pawn, and there's several reasons Nimzowitsch gives for pushing a pawn. And he gives this position as kind of a funny reason, a strange reason for why you're going to be pushing this pawn. Black's obviously in front of it, and he's going to be able to stop it from queening on the surface. So what's white's actual goal here? Well, let's see what happens. So he pushes the pawn, black steps back, okay, and then white comes forward. Black grabs the opposition, although Nimzowitsch never uses that word. Check, king comes back. They're playing it like a drawn king and pawn endgame, except there's an extra pair of pawns over here. And if there were not that extra pair of pawns, then right here this would be a stalemate. So white's objective in pushing that pawn all the way was to stalemate the black king, so to speak, because now he's forced to push his a-pawn. And he has two choices. If he pushes to a6, then the correct move for white is a4, because that gives black one more tempo with his pawn, and now white can step aside and let the king out and then promote his pawn. Going back, if he had pushed the pawn to a5 instead, then the correct move is to push the pawn to a3, giving black one more tempo, and then he steps aside and queens his pawn. So that's just an interesting king and pawn endgame. Okay, let's take a look at this position. So here, this is an actual game. Nimzowitsch is white, and he wants to draw this position in a clever way by giving up the exchange. And he sees about 7 moves into the future, and it all plays out exactly as he foresees. So Nimzowitsch is white, and he plays rook here, check, forking the king and the bishop. King moves here, and then Nimzowitsch gives up the exchange. G takes f6, A takes b5. c4 is sensible to get that king quickly over here. Okay, white takes the h-pawn, knowing that black is going to place his rook on the h-file and get an h-pawn back. Okay, white moves here. Black takes that h-pawn, but then white gets the f-pawn. Now the black king marches over to grab that passed b pawn. And here is Nimzowicz's point of making that exchange sacrifice. He sees this isolated pawn, and he heads for it with his king. And he has a lot of theory in this chapter about the king approaching an isolated pawn head on like that and the power of it. And so he was playing for this position where his king was headed for that f4 square. Okay? And at this point, right here, the example stops and Nimzowitsch says he got an easy draw, which looks drawn to me. Although Nimzowitsch adds a little drama to the example. He says that black actually missed a win. His opponent was Rubinstein, and he said Rubinstein missed a win on his 7th move. Let's have a look. Okay, he said that black playing king takes b5 was a mistake, and instead he should have tried to thwart white's plan of getting his king to this ideal f4 square. He said black should have played rook h6, attacking the bishop. Bishop probably moves with check. Then he takes on b5. King comes up. Rook comes to the e file with check, so that if the king comes to f4, then black turns the tables on white by doing the same thing white did. Black plays rook to e4 check, forking the king and the bishop with the intent of giving up the exchange by capturing on d4 in order to queen his c-pawn. And Nimzowitsch ends the analysis here and says black has won. And he simply says black's next move is to take on d4, and he wins. Unfortunately, it's another case of Nimzowitsch making a mistake. It's kind of fun to find these mistakes with the help of the engine. But again, it doesn't really detract from this book. Turns out white has a draw here. Okay, and I think Nimzowitsch probably assumed white was going to take this pawn, and then yes, this is a clear win for black. But the engine tells me no, white should play king to f3, and then if black does take the bishop and give up the exchange, then this king is within the square of that pawn and can stop it. And this is going to be a draw with best play. And here's a sample line: c3, king e2, king b4, pushing the pawn as a decoy, king runs back up to get it, and both players mutually take this pawn here. And it's actually white that's up a pawn, but it's a drawn king and pawn endgame because black grabs the opposition here and his king is far enough forward. I won't analyze this king and pawn endgame in detail. I actually did a similar endgame analysis in another video where we showed how white can win 2 versus 1 like this if his king can get up the board a little further, but black's king is posted far enough up the board to stop white. So just as the endgame table bases tell me, this is a drawn position. So another funny error in that example. And we'll look at one last position. I find this one fascinating. It's black to move, and when I first looked at this position, I didn't really know who was winning, and I looked at it and realized it's probably white that's winning because white is threatening to push his pawn to c3 and exchange this pair of pawns, and then white has that outside passer. And so then I read Nimzowicz's analysis, and he says the same thing. He says white's threat here is to push his pawn to c3, but I didn't realize that black has a miraculous defense to this idea. Not only is it a miraculous defense, but it's a winning defense. Black is actually winning this position. And when I turn the engine on, it says, sure enough, negative 12.2 here. Let's see how black does this. The winning move is king to c7. And white doesn't have anything better than c3. You can analyze other moves. For example, c4 is similar. But let's see what happens with c3. I won't give an exhaustive analysis of the position. The point is, black is going to play king to b6 and give up that pawn, and then approach it. And there's that key idea again of grabbing that square right in front of a pawn. It's not isolated this time. There's another pawn here. But white needs to save that pawn, and playing a3 doesn't really do the job because black will get in there with his king and take that pawn, and he'll still be threatening that pawn. You can take a look at that if you want to. So maybe white's best try is king to c3, but then king to a4 is winning. Nimzowitsch stops the analysis there and says, okay, now black won. And I think it's because white can't save both of these pawns, the A and the B pawn. It's got to give at least one of them up. But black's king is so far advanced, it's placed so much better than white's that he's going to lose both of those pawns, actually. Okay, let's see how this might go. Okay, white can either abandon the B pawn, move his king away and give that up. Maybe he can play A3 and protect the B pawn and then give up the A pawn. If he does that, he's eventually going to lose that B pawn as well. Or maybe he can just play king b2 and guard his A pawn and give that up. But like I said, that black king is placed just too well here. A3 check, king c4. He tries to run with that pawn, but black gets back in time to stop it. Then his connected passers are going to decide. So it's a very interesting endgame, worth study. I won't give an exhaustive analysis of it, but it just baffles me that black is winning this position, and the winning maneuver is to back up with the king and then bring it back forward and get the better king placement by running backwards at first. So fascinating. So excellent chapter, another excellent chapter. By the way, I'm not really doing the book justice. Nimzowitsch has quite the wit, quite the sense of humor. He gives these endless metaphors about what's going on in the games, and it's quite entertaining. And I'm not really talking about every detail of his theories. So even if you're watching these videos, you still probably should get your hands on a copy of this book and read it at some point. Okay, thanks for watching the video. I'll probably make another one for the next chapter.